What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica, and in each of these videos I sit down here with you guys and we discuss a different true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. So if that sounds good to you, I'd say subscribe, stick around, and join me back here each week. If the combination isn't speaking to you, but you're still interested in the case details, I've got some links down in the description for you. But for those of you who are sticking around, let's go ahead and get into today's case. March 24th, 1944, the bodies of 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames were found bludgeoned to death and discarded in a waterlogged ditch in Alcolu, South Carolina. A frantic search for the girls had started the previous evening when they had failed to return home from a bike ride, and devastatingly, that search had concluded when they were discovered, bludgeoned to death and dumped like trash in a watery ditch. However, while their deaths were undeniably heartbreaking, there's no debate to be had about that. However, what I think eclipses that tragedy is how police ended up going on to handle this case. And the way that it was ultimately resolved, well, all I can say is buckle the fuck up, y'all. Because this shit, it absolutely makes me sick to my stomach. This is the story of the wrongful conviction and execution of 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. Yeah, 14. It is in fact gonna be a rough one. All right, so for today's case, not only are we heading down to the southern US, but we are also headed back to the early to mid 1900s. And if you know anything about anything, then you know just as well as I do that that isn't exactly a great time or place to find ourselves. But alas, here we are. Specifically today, our story takes place primarily in a teeny tiny little town called Alcolu, South Carolina. Actually, Alcolu is so small that even to this day, it remains an unincorporated community located in Clarendon County. Resting on just 4.5 square miles of land and hosting a population of just 400 people as of 2020. Alcolu is most well known for its old lumber mill and timber company. It's known for its historical museums and its art gallery. I think there's also an old opera house either in or very near the town as well. So I guess you know that now. But far and away, I think that the thing that the town is most well known for, and likely the thing that it will always be most well known for, is this story that I'll be sharing with you here today. George Stinney Jr. was born on October 21st, 1929 in Pinewood, South Carolina to his parents, George Stinney Sr. and Amy Brown Stinney. George was the couple's firstborn, so he was obviously the oldest of their 4 children. George came first, followed closely by his little brother Charles, his little sister Catherine, and then finally his littlest sister Amy. Outside of that little nuclear family unit, George did also have 2 half-brothers. Their names were Leroy and Johnny. These 2 young men had come from relationships that George's parents had had prior to meeting one another. So, of course, they were still part of the family. But at the time our story takes place, I don't believe that either of them were actually living at the Stinney home. To my knowledge, Johnny was living with his grandparents, but as far as Leroy is concerned, I'm not really sure if he was just older and he was already out on his own, or if he was also living with some variation of other family members. Personally, I couldn't really find clarification on that, but it doesn't really affect the story in the grand scheme of things in any way. So it doesn't really matter. Sorry, Leroy. The point is that as far as George's family home was concerned, that was comprised of his parents, George and Amy, and then he and his siblings, Charles, Catherine, and Amy.
What?
Sorry, I feel like I made that more confusing than it needed to be, but 'tis also my brand, so are we surprised?
No, not really.
At any rate, as I'm sure you can imagine, for the Stinneys, living through this time in America where racism and segregation were just the norm, I think it's safe for us to assume that George and his family likely faced more than their fair share of hardships between the 6 of them. And that's before even taking into consideration the absolute clusterfuck of a story that gathers us here today. Sure, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery almost 80 years before this story even takes place, but then Jim Crow laws came about swiftly after in order to continue the oppression and the marginalization of Black people in the US. So the improvements to their quality of life were slim, to say the least. Truly just a shameful and frankly embarrassing stain on our nation's history. All of it. Slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, separate but equal, vile. But sadly, this is the time period that George grew up in, and this is the time period that his family was forced to live in. Like most Jim Crow era communities, while white and black men did work side by side, at the end of the day, they would ultimately go their separate ways and they would head back to their respective neighborhoods. Neighborhoods, which, mind you, were complete with separate schools, separate churches, and even separate grocery stores. So beyond the fact that these people might have worked together, contact between the white and black communities within Alcolu, by design, was extremely limited. In fact, most of the sources that you'll come across that cover this case, they will explicitly state that Alcolu's white and black neighborhoods were physically divided by the town's railroad tracks. However, with that said, I do want to say that a book that I read about this case stated that that was actually not factually accurate. So honestly, I'm not really comfortable stating whether the town really was set up that way or not. Basically, I'll give you the information, and from there, you can choose to believe what you want.
Okay.
Truth be told, I wouldn't put anything past the white people of that era. We all know that they did some egregious and inexcusable, horrible things to people of color. I just can't personally say definitively if this specific geographical distinction really did exist. Nevertheless, though, circling us back around to the Stinney family, from what I was able to gather throughout my research, it simply appears as though they were a normal, sweet, working class family. I mentioned earlier that Alcolu was well known for its lumber mill, which employed and housed a considerable majority of the black and white residents of the town, including George Stinney Sr. George's father worked at the mill, which then provided his family with a quaint, modest 3-bedroom home. Obviously, this home was located on the black side of town, which is where Amy then worked as a cook at the Alcolu School for Black Children. Coincidentally, this is also where the Stinney children attended their classes. Sure, they weren't living in the lap of luxury, not by a long shot, but as far as I was able to tell, they were happy. They were just 6 people trying their best to get by in a world that was literally designed to keep them down. A world built strategically with their continued oppression in mind. Yet even still, somehow, they were managing to make the most of it. They worked their asses off to ensure that they had enough to get by. Both parents worked, they grew their own produce, they had chickens, they had a cow. They weren't rich, but they were surviving. And most importantly, they had each other. And at a time like this, you really couldn't ask for much else, even if they certainly deserved more than the hand that they were dealt. But little did they know that all it would take to completely unravel and destroy the happy, modest life that they had worked so hard to build was one innocent conversation. A few words exchanged about flowers, of all things. And sadly, my friends, that does in fact bring us to the afternoon of Friday, March 24th, 1944. As is the case in most of these stories, that Friday had started out like any other day typically would have for the Stinney family. George Sr. made his way off to the lumber mill. Amy made her way off to the school for her shift. And of course, the children then made their way to their respective classes. Like I said, just a completely average day for this family. Dad off to work, mom off to work, and kids off to school. To my knowledge, typically the kids would arrive home first, so I believe they'd do any leftover schoolwork that they had before they would then eventually disperse to complete all of their assigned household chores. Whether it was tending to the garden, doing cleaning around the house, tending to the animals, whatever the case may be, each of the Stinney children had their own assigned chores that they were expected to complete each and every day. And as for George, one of his chores was to take his family's cow, Lizzie, out for a walk to graze, which you can't tell me isn't the cutest thing you've ever heard. That is just one of the most wholesome things that a person could imagine. George and his little sister taking their cow out for a walk. Be still, my beating heart. I can't imagine anything cuter. Now, granted, I really like cows, so maybe that's it. Maybe that's the reason that it warms my heart so much. Or it could also be that Amy loved and looked up to George so much, and she followed him around so much that the family jokingly referred to her as George's shadow. And that's real cute to me too. So it's probably just a combination of all those things. Unfortunately, it stops being cute once you find out that what started as a wholesome brother-sister routine ultimately started a domino effect that would irreparably devastate the Stinney family. You see, completely unbeknownst to George, at the same time that he and Amy set out to walk their cow, on the other side of town, 2 other little girls were setting out after school to go and pick flowers. And yes, when I say the other side of town, I do in fact mean the white side of town. 11-year-old 4th grade student Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old 1st grade student Mary Emma Thames left their homes and met up around 3 p.m. that day with plans to ride their bikes together and to go out and search for maypop flowers. And if you're like me and you have no idea what the hell a maypop flower is, please allow me to enlighten you with the information that Google bequeathed unto me. So apparently a maypop flower, it's actually not really a flower at all. It's actually the egg-shaped greenish-yellow fruit produced by the purple passion flora incarnata, otherwise more commonly known as the purple passion flower. I guess this little fruit is like kind of sweet, it's a little bit tart, and based off of reviews online, some people liken the taste to passion fruit or to guava, while some others describe the taste as a mix between a banana and a kiwi. Basically, the girls going out to look for these flowery little fruit things, it reminds me of when we were all growing up and we used to go out with our friends to look for honeysuckles, right? Did everybody else used to do that, or am I just like really old? Look, you don't get to judge me if you're younger than me. We didn't have smartphones when I was young. We didn't have supercomputers in our pockets. We barely had the internet. So entertainment wasn't exactly at our fingertips 24/7 like it is for kids today. We had to go out and we had to make our own fun, okay?
I'm old.
And along that same vein, going out and making their own fun was exactly what Betty June and Mary Emma were out doing that day. They were just out being little girls, riding their bikes, and looking for flowers. They weren't doing anything wrong. Just like George wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just out doing his chores, walking his cow. Just 3 innocent children out doing innocent child things. And yet, somehow, this afternoon would ultimately see to the death of all 3 of these children. Now, logically, one might assume that George and Amy, they likely wouldn't have crossed paths with Betty and Mary. You know, given that these 4 children lived in separate, segregated parts of town, you'd think the chances of them coming into contact would be slim to none. But somehow, purely by happenstance, George and his sister would actually end up crossing paths with Betty and Mary. Now, my guess is that Betty and Emma, I think it's more likely that they crossed over into the black neighborhood on pursuit of their maypops, rather than George and Amy wandering over into the white neighborhood. Obviously, I can't say for sure, but one, I assume that white children would be a lot more likely to cross over into a black neighborhood than black children at that time would have been to dare cross over into a white neighborhood, ridiculous as that is today. But also, according to later interviews with his siblings, George was only ever supposed to walk Lizzie at the most a few hundred yards from their home. And when asked later about the situation, Amy claimed that they were still in sight of their home when they had crossed Betty and Mary's paths. But regardless of how exactly it happened, at one point or another, these 4 children did very briefly cross paths with one another. The girls noticed George and Amy from afar. They called over to them and they asked them if they knew where they could find any maypop flowers. George respectfully responded that no, he didn't. And that was it. The girls took their bikes, they went on their way, and George and Amy took Lizzie and they turned and they headed back home. All in all, I think that George and Amy were only out of the house for like an hour, maybe, give or take, before they had to be back home to get ready for dinner. It's my understanding that the family as a whole had plans to go out that night to like a neighborhood gathering, like dinner party type situation. But sadly, while the Stinneys were readying themselves for this get-together, Betty and Mary's parents were starting to panic. They were realizing that their children had been gone for far longer than they had planned to be. They had heard nothing from them, no one had seen them, and it was starting to get late. Actually, it was while the Stinneys were at this dinner get-together thing that word started to spread like wildfire through both sides of town that Betty and Mary they were missing. And so, as the sun began to set and the minutes turned to hours, a big group of the community's men began to form, and they were heading out to hopefully go and find the girls. By the next morning, almost 200 volunteers had ended up gathering together and spanning out across the town, all with the sole hope of finding Betty and Mary alive and well. And unfortunately, what's kind of frustrating, given how this whole story goes on to play out. Once George and his father had heard that the girls were missing, they both too went out on their own accord. They joined these search parties and they did their own due diligence in trying to help track these girls down. And in my opinion, this speaks to the kind of people that the Stinneys were. Because I'm sorry, but I can almost guarantee you that if the tables were turned and George and Amy were the ones to have gone missing, I don't know, man. It is very hard for me to believe that the white side of town would have inconvenienced themselves to then go out and search for them. Now, I could be wrong. I suppose anything is possible, but just given the era of time that we're in, coupled with how, again, the rest of the story goes on to play out, I don't know. Personally, I don't see it. But when it came to George and his dad, they weren't thinking like that. They were just two genuinely good people who saw a problem and they wanted to do what they could to be part of the solution. Sadly, something that in time, I imagine they would come to deeply regret. Now, when George Jr. had heard that the girls were missing, I believe he mentioned in passing to his dad before they went out searching that he had actually seen the girls and even spoken to them prior to their disappearance. Information that I assume he wasn't trying to keep secret. He probably thought that giving up that information would be helpful. However, somehow, and I'm not sure I will ever understand how, but ultimately that information would become the very thing that the town would use to completely turn against the Stinney family. As the sun came up that following morning, so it's Saturday, March 25th at this point, devastatingly, one of the search parties came upon an unimaginably grisly scene. It was while searching the property of, ironically, the sawmill's manager, George Burke, that one of the groups came upon what they later described as a disturbed patch of grass. And as they approached this disturbed grassy area, they noticed that what they were actually making their way towards was a ditch. And sadly, it was within this waterlogged ditch that the group discovered the badly beaten bodies of both Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames. Both girls were lying face up in the ditch, while Betty, horrifyingly, was lying beneath her own bicycle. And pretty much right away, just from a cursory glance at the girls, it was obvious that not only had they been there for a while, but it was also pretty evident that they had been through it prior to their bodies being left here. Aside from the fact that Betty's bike looked like it had almost been hit by a car and it was missing a wheel, Betty herself was later determined to have been struck at least 7 times. And Mary was later determined to have been struck at least 6. And although Mary suffered less blows, her injuries were actually more extensive. She had been beaten so severely that she had been effectively rendered unrecognizable. Truly, it was just a horrific scene. I can't even begin to imagine how traumatizing it must have been for these people to have come across this. That said, though, this search group hadn't been searching this particular land completely unprompted. The only reason they'd even ended up on that property after searching the rest of the town all night was because they had discovered a path of shoe prints in the dirt. First, they discovered the shoe prints, and they followed those, and that's when they discovered then a pair of garden scissors, as well as a bunch of maypop flowers, presumably all belonging to the girls. And I'd have to imagine that after searching all night and finding nothing, seeing these things, the search party probably got excited, hopeful even. They were finally getting somewhere with this search. But sadly, we know that those footprints led the group directly to the watery ditch that the girls' bodies were ultimately found. And whether they had truly anticipated finding the girls at the end of that trail of footprints or not, I can't imagine that anything could have prepared them for the sheer brutality that had clearly been acted out upon these girls before they had been left there in the woods. Now, there was a moment right after the group had found the girls that someone said they believed that they had seen one of the girls take a breath, which, hearing this, 15-year-old Francis Baston, yes, 15, he jumped straight into the ditch and he took it upon himself to pull both of the girls out of it. Sadly, though, not only was this in vain, given the fact that both girls were way beyond any life-saving measures at that point. But it also probably wasn't really ideal for any sort of criminal investigation. And that's not to criticize what Frances did. I can absolutely understand from a humanity standpoint not wanting to just stand there and do nothing while these poor little girls were lying in the mud and the rainwater. I'm just saying that knowing what we know now, you're not supposed to physically interfere with scenes like this. One thing that Frances did note, though, that he later spoke out about, was that when he was pulling the girls out of this ditch, he didn't see any blood at the scene. He didn't see any footprints or any drag marks leading up to the ditch. It was as if the girls had almost just appeared with no trace in sight as to how or when. And this was definitely noteworthy because think about it. These girls had quite literally been bludgeoned to death, and yet there was barely any discernible blood at the scene, if any. I suppose that could be explained away by the fact that it had been raining most of the previous night. So maybe the rainwater had washed away any and all traces of blood from the girls' deaths. But I think that the more widely believed theory out there is that these girls were likely killed somewhere else prior to then having their bodies brought here and abandoned in this ditch. Following their autopsies, it was determined by the medical examiner that the girls' injuries had likely been caused by a blunt object with a rounded head. So something similar to either a pipe or a hammer. Additionally, the ME also noted that while the girls had both been horrifically beaten, there actually wasn't much bruising on either of them beyond the wounds that had been made to their heads. More specifically, he noted that there was little to no additional bruising on Mary outside of her obvious injuries. And while Betty did have a small bruise on her private area, based on this particular medical examiner's experience, he stated with confidence that he did not believe that this was the kind of bruise that would have been indicative of any sort of sexual crime. Actually, on the contrary, he deduced that it was more likely a bruise that one might get from riding a bike, per se. Something that we obviously know that the girls were doing right before their deaths. And even taking that one step further, the ME also noted that both of the girls' hymens were still intact following their deaths. And I know that sounds incredibly invasive, but I assure you it is important. Basically, the takeaway here is that this medical examiner ruled out with professional certainty any inkling that these girls could have experienced any sort of sexual trauma prior to their death. And again, remember that because, like I said, it is important. Moving on from that for now, though, it should go without saying that, obviously, this crime and the discovery of these girls' bodies, it was devastating to everyone in Alcolu, and rightfully so. Nothing like this had ever happened in this community before now. So I have to imagine people were absolutely wigging out. Police immediately set out to start questioning people. Obviously, they wanted to narrow down their suspect pool, and ultimately they wanted to identify the sick son of a bitch that did this to these girls. They wanted to see to it that this person was prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, which sounds great in theory. But you want to hear some bullshit? Where do you think the police started their investigation? You think they started it with the white man whose property they found the girls' bodies on? You think they started it on the white side of town, questioning those closest to the girls and gradually moving outwards, as is pretty much customary today? Of course not. Of course, them good old boys in blue headed straight over to the black side of town, because you know, it definitely had to be someone from that neck of the woods that was responsible, right?
Man, boo. Tomato, tomato, tomato. I'm throwing tomatoes.
And if by chance you think that I'm reading into this too far, one, I'm not, but two, have you been listening? They weren't just going out to question the black residents of Alcolu. They weren't simply looking to ask around or see if anyone knew anything, if anyone had seen anything, heard anything. No. Nothing like that. All it took was for one fuck-ass person to mention to police that George had admitted to speaking to the girls shortly before their disappearance. And with that one single statement, that was all it took to entirely seal poor George's fate. Yeah. So then cut to the Stinney house that same afternoon, Saturday, March 25th. You've got George Sr., he's off working. You've got George's mom and his brother. They're off at the grocery store, meaning that the only members of the family that were home that afternoon were George, Catherine, and Amy. Oh, and Johnny, George's half-brother, he had actually ended up stopping by briefly that day to surprise his family with the news that he was headed off to the army. Point in all of this being that it was just some of the Stinney children that were home that day when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, 2 unmarked Clarendon County police cars came barreling up their driveway. Something that obviously completely freaked all of these children out. Because like I said, not only were these cars unmarked, but the officers, they weren't in uniform. They were just in like plain nondescript suits. So when they descended onto this house with absolutely no warning and likely little to no couth, if I had to guess, this scared poor little Amy, who, mind you, was only 8 years old at the time. It terrified her so much that she quite literally ran and hid in her family's chicken coop out of fear of what these men were planning to do to her and her family. So clearly, they could not have shown up to this house in any sort of orderly fashion. In no way did these men lead these children to think that they were safe or that they could trust them. And you know what? Props to the girls for trusting their gut, because these men, they were not there to help or to protect them. No, these cops stormed into the Stinney home. They were uninvited and unannounced, and within minutes, they had handcuffed both George and Johnny under suspicion of murder. Yeah, dude, fucking insane. I mean, arresting George that day was ludicrous enough. Just because this boy had spoken to these girls, now you think he killed them? But then to arrest Johnny too, because what? Because he was also there and also black? I mean, what the fuck? Poor little Catherine and Amy, they had no idea what to do or who to turn to. They were like 10 and 8, maybe, at this time. And all they're seeing are these 2 strange men burst into their house and cart their big brothers away. Amy, in particular, oh my God, she was distraught. When she saw them dragging George away, she just started screaming and crying and yelling, asking where he was going and why he was leaving her. And as much as I'm sure he wanted to comfort her, he probably didn't realize or understand what the hell was going on either. All he managed to yell back was to tell her to try to find someone to help her get a hold of their mom. And that was it. Within seconds of what had started out as a completely normal day for the Stinney children, in the blink of an eye had descended into madness and calamity. And devastatingly, unbeknownst to any of the Stinney children, that would be the last time that most of them would ever see their brother George alive ever again. Amy, in a later interview, recounted the incident in harrowing detail, stating, quote, "I never saw him again, not until he was in his casket. I can't even begin to imagine my kids being separated and not understanding why and how traumatizing and confusing that would be for them. Like, thinking about that makes me feel sick. To imagine the fear and the bewilderment that this poor little girl must have been feeling in that moment, having no idea what was going on. It's horrible. And that's not even taking into consideration the fact that when these police officers carted George and Johnny away, this left her and her barely older than her sister home alone to try to figure out what to do next. I mean, in my opinion, that in and of itself is its whole ass own other issue, but I digress. Following their arrests, both George and Johnny were taken down to the police station, where they were both held without so much as a whisper to their parents as to what was going on, which is just absolutely fucking bananas, if you ask me. These kids were teenagers, and while realistically, this would never happen now. Back then, the whole minor can't be questioned without a guardian or lawyer present, that thing that we all know and love now, yeah, that wasn't a thing back then. That didn't become standard practice, let alone law, until much, much later. 1966, I believe. So like 20 some odd years after what we're dealing with here. Yeah. Yikes. Both boys were questioned for quite a while. However, after just a few hours, Johnny was ultimately released. Do not misinterpret that, though, to mean that he was treated well or with respect or anything like that, because no. Once police were done with him, they quite literally took Johnny from the police station and they dropped him off on the side of the highway between Manning and Kingstree. They pushed him out of the car onto the side of the road, and then they just drove away. It took him hours to walk the miles and miles from where they had abandoned him all the way back to his house. And this was unbelievably traumatizing for Johnny. He was so shaken up by this over the following years that he refused to even talk about what had happened to him that day, or about what ultimately ended up happening to George. He couldn't handle any of it. It truly seems as though this day completely broke this poor young man. But even with as appalling as that treatment was, it pales in comparison to what police had planned for George. Between these two brothers, believe it or not, Johnny got the good end of the deal. Following Johnny's release, police continued to incessantly question and to ferociously interrogate George. For hours, they berated this poor child, just hurling accusations at him and demanding answers from him without so much as ever even offering him the option to speak to his parents or to try to retain legal counsel. I mean, it is just absolutely unbelievable, the things that I am saying to you right now, that this shit actually happened. This was a 14-year-old child, a 14-year-old underprivileged Black child at that was forced to alone take on a justice system made up of white men who were conditioned to not just suspect his guilt, but they were conditioned to expect it. Christ, we've seen full-blown, fully educated, much more privileged adults fumble criminal interrogations and end up behind bars. So to think for even 1 second that a 14-year-old boy with minimal education could sufficiently take up for himself against this system that was built against him, let's be real, there was no freaking way that this situation was going to pan out well for George. He didn't have a snowball's chance in hell of walking out of that interrogation room that day as anything other than a prisoner. And horrifyingly, later that evening, Clarendon County Deputy Sheriff H.S. Newman announced to the media that George had in fact confessed to killing both Betty and Mary, apparently. If it's not obvious, know that I say confessed with an egregious level of sarcasm, because understandably so, there's been a lot of discourse spanning from all the way back then, all the way to now, surrounding whether or not George actually made this supposed confession. I think I even saw one source that claimed that all it took was some ice cream to get George to confess, but whether that's true or not, whether he truly did confess or not, there is quite literally not a singular shred of proof to corroborate that this confession really did happen. No recording, no documented signed confession, nothing. All there ever was to support Newman's claim that George had confessed was a transcription of said confession written by none other than H.S. Newman himself. Yes, according to Newman's handwritten statement, George had supposedly confessed to murdering Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames with a piece of iron approximately 15 inches long. I believe this weapon was likened to a railroad spike at one point or another. And according to Newman's statement, George had admitted to murdering the girls with this after deciding to rape Betty June Binnicker. Supposedly, he claimed he tried to rape Betty June, but that Mary had objected, ultimately leading George to bludgeon her before then doing the same to Betty. And I'll be the first to say that this story, it's awful. While it's graphic and harrowing and devastating, most importantly, it's bullshit. George did not murder these girls. He had absolutely nothing to do with their deaths. Anyone with 2 brain cells to rub together can see that, but it was too late. As the news of George's confession started to spread, almost instantaneously, the rest of the Stinney's lives, they began to unravel as well. Following the news of his son's confession, George Sr. was immediately fired from the lumber mill, which in turn then rendered him, his wife, and his remaining children homeless, because if you'll remember, their home was provided by their father's job at the mill. And then, as if that wasn't enough, on top of that, the family then also began to catch wind of a potential lynch mob headed their way. Like, I can't even sit here and pretend for 1 second and say that I can even begin to imagine half of the terror and the fear that must have been struck into the hearts of these poor, innocent people. Not only had their very own son been ripped out of their home and jailed for a crime he didn't commit, but now a bunch of backwoods bigoted hillbillies are potentially on the move and ready to seek retribution on this entire family. This era is truly such a skid mark on the underpants of American history. Like, it is gross that people routinely used to treat other people like this. It is inexcusable. This poor family quite literally had to grab whatever they could carry with their hands before they then ultimately were forced to flee to a relative's house about 20 miles outside of Alcolu. I believe it was located in Pinewood, South Carolina. And while his family was forced to flee for their lives, George was briefly booked into Clarendon County Jail before he too had to be moved to a jail 50 miles away in Columbia after police caught wind that there was a lynch mob headed straight for him as well. And this is like a real fucking thing that used to happen, I guess. Lynch mobs would form and then they'd show up at a jail. They would break someone out just so that they could then turn around and kill them themselves. Absolute barbaric anarchy. Don't get me wrong, I at least appreciate the fact that they did move George, that they didn't leave him there like a sitting duck for these vigilante lunatics. But I mean, how low is the bar in this story that action is considered like commendable?
The bar's literally in hell.
And it was in that cell, in that jail in Columbia, where George would sit for the following month leading up to his trial. He was completely alone, completely isolated, with absolutely no way to see or even to contact his family during this imprisonment. But even from afar, George's family never stopped advocating for him. Day in and day out, they did everything that they possibly could to fight for him and to try to save him. But sadly, during that time, there just wasn't really much of anything that they could do. Helpless as they were, though, they never once wavered on their belief in George's innocence. The Stinneys always maintained that George was innocent. They never stopped asserting that he never could have, nor ever would have, done anything even close to what he stood accused of. And when confronted with George's supposed confession, the Stinneys always said that even if he had confessed to the crime, it had to be false. They knew George too well, and they knew that he was just simply too young and too naive to have handled the pressure that was undoubtedly put on him by law enforcement. But even with no personal ties to the case, even with no skin in the game, again, anyone with two fucking brain cells to squeak together like them fucking pickles from the Bubble Bass episode of SpongeBob. Anyone with a logical thought to be thunk can look at the facts of this case and tell you that George, he did not do this. Sure, maybe George was older than both the girls. Fine. But he was only 5'1". He weighed 90 pounds soaking wet. Together, these two girls probably had a good 20 to 30 pounds on him. So there is likely no way that he could have overpowered both of them by himself, given just the slightness of his frame alone. Then bearing that thought in mind, I invite you to journey back to Francis Baston. Remember the kid that pulled the girls out of the ditch? He distinctly remembered that there was no blood and no drag marks at the scene where the girls were found. So you mean to tell me that little 90-pound George killed these girls somewhere else, overpowered them, killed them, and then fully carried their bodies from the murder scene all the way to the dump scene by himself? He did that by himself, leaving no evidence and all in time to make it home for dinner. And what about Amy? She was with him all afternoon. She didn't see any of this? Get fucking real with me right now. None of what police were saying made sense. None of these pieces fit together to make a cohesive story. Whatever cops had managed to weave together, it was clearly just a heaping, stank-ass pile of bullshit. George did not kill these girls. That is just an objective fact. Yet he was arrested, interrogated, and ultimately charged with the murder of both of these girls less than 12 hours after their bodies were discovered. He was held without bond. He was kept isolated from seeing or speaking to his parents, and he was barely afforded legal counsel. I mean, technically, he did have representation, but much like the rest of the justice system at the time, his defense was a joke. A farce, if you will. George's trial began on April 24th, 1944 at 2:30 p.m. The trial was held in special session at the Clarendon County Courthouse with the Honorable Judge P.H. Stoll presiding. And when I tell you guys that this was the event of the century in Alcolu, I mean it. Nearly 1,500 people showed up and completely packed the courtroom to watch this trial play out. The courtroom was packed, the hallways of the courthouse were packed, a huge group of people crowded outside the courthouse to, I don't know, just be able to say that they were there. But out of all of these people that were in attendance, the people who wanted to be there the most, they were banned from attending. You see, Black people were not allowed to attend court trials back then, at least in South Carolina. So despite how painful it was for George's family, they couldn't attend his trial. This poor child had not a single friendly or supportive face there for him in that courtroom as his life hung in the balance. Instead, he had to sit there stoically, surrounded by almost 2,000 people who all believed in his guilt and believed he deserved what was coming to him. And normally, in a case like this, a case that's this high profile, you might expect that the defendant's lawyer would, at the very least, request a change of venue, right? Well, not George's lawyer, but that's because George's lawyer had absolutely no business serving as anyone's criminal defense lawyer. Homeboy could not have defended a chicken sandwich, let alone a whole-ass innocent child on trial for a double homicide. This man was a tax attorney. Yes, Charles Plowden, George's lawyer, was actually Clarendon County's elected tax commissioner. He did not have a single iota of experience acting as a defense attorney in a criminal trial. But because George was Black and his family didn't have a lot of money to secure him a proper defense, Clarendon County saddled him with the absolute worst possible stand-in. Not only had this man literally never served as a defense attorney for anyone prior to this trial, but Plowden, he was also up for re-election that very same year. So do you think that he wanted to get up there and rock the boat, piss people off by presenting a real defense for George? Stand up and rally for the town pariah? I mean, I think we all know enough about politicians to know that George would have had better odds if he had stood up there alone and defended himself than he had with his fate resting in Charles Plowden's hands. I truly cannot stress to you enough just how little of a defense this man truly put forward for George. Like I said, he didn't request a change of venue. He didn't call Amy to corroborate George's alibi. He didn't fight against George's clearly bullshit confession. Officer Newman testified that George had taken him to the murder weapon, yet it was nowhere to be found during trial. Plowden didn't contest that. He didn't even cross-examine Officer Newman. He didn't cross-examine any of the witnesses that the prosecution called. He also didn't call any of his own witnesses that could have provided any sort of a defense for George. Now, George's supposed confession, it included the alleged sexual assault of Betty June Binnicker. So why couldn't Plowden be bothered to call in the medical examiner to testify to his professional opinion that neither of the girls had been the victim of any sort of a sex crime? Like I said, this man did nothing to try to defend George. He did not lift a single fucking finger to fight for this boy. And as a result of George's lack of a defense, his entire trial lasted less than 3 hours. 2 hours and 15 minutes. To be exact. Trial commenced at 2:30, and the jurors were excused for deliberations at 4:45. Absolutely unbelievable. A double murder trial nowadays can take over a year. Look at the Idaho case. It's been almost 3 years since those kids were murdered, and that case still hasn't gone to trial. Yet George was arrested, charged, and tried within a singular month. And what's even worse, if you can believe it, is that it only took the jury 10 minutes to determine this boy's fate. By 5 p.m. on Monday, April 24th, 1944, the all-white jury returned, finding 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. guilty of the murders of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames. They delivered their verdict. The foreman read it loudly and proudly, and when asked if George should be shown mercy, in other words, if he should be spared the death penalty, the jury decided that no, he should not, and therefore, no, he should not. According to South Carolina law in 1944, if a defendant was found guilty of capital murder, the judge had no choice but to sentence that person to death unless the jury recommended mercy. In that event, George's sentence would have been reduced to life in prison. However, since they decided that he deserved no mercy, 14-year-old George was subsequently sentenced to death by electric chair. And from that moment on, George was given 53 days to live. His execution was scheduled for June 16th, 1944. Just devastating. Absolutely heartbreaking. Not to mention unimaginable, because this would just never happen nowadays. Not this fast, at least. For starters, at just 14, George would have never even been eligible for the death penalty to begin with, had this taken place in modern times. Following a 5-4 ruling in the Supreme Court case of Roper v. Simmons, in March of 2005, it was determined that the execution of individuals who were under the age of 18 at the time of their crimes was considered to be a cruel and unusual form of punishment. Therefore, it would no longer be permitted as per the Eighth Amendment. On top of that, even today, if George was found guilty, he would have access to so many potential appeals. Now, that's not to say that he didn't have the ability to appeal back then. He just didn't know that he did. And of course, his shitbag lawyer certainly didn't bother telling him. He just couldn't pass up even a single opportunity to be an absolute limp dick loser. Honestly, I think the only thing that even remotely close to a silver lining that I can begin to try to trudge up for you is that in the wake of his sentencing, George was finally able to see his parents again, even if it was just one final time. George saw his parents for the final time on Sunday, May 21st, 1944. They came to visit him at the Central Correctional Institute in Columbia, South Carolina, where despite all that he had been through, despite how defeated I'm sure George was by this point, he still continued to profess his innocence. He promised his parents that he had nothing to do with the death of these girls. He swore up and down that he had never confessed to Officer Newman, and above all else, he just expressed how scared he was. And sadly, in leaving the jail that day, George's parents knew that, in all likelihood, they would never see their son alive ever again. And they were right. Just after 7 a.m. on Friday, June 16th, 1944, 82 days after his arrest, 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. was led to the execution chamber. As the story goes, George carried nothing but a Bible with him, and supposedly because George was so small in stature, he actually had to use that Bible as a makeshift booster seat in order to properly situate himself in the electric chair. When given the opportunity, George declined to make any sort of final statement. Nobody had been listening to him up to this point, so I get it. Why bother? According to George's cellmate, though, at the time, one of the last things that George said to him before he was taken away was, quote, "Why would they kill me for something I didn't do?" And likely that question was the only thing playing on repeat in George's head as the executioner threw the switch, subsequently blasting a 2,400-volt current through George's tiny little body. Evidently, this current was so strong that it threw George's head back, loosening the leather death mask that had been placed over him, revealing his face to those in the viewing room. According to these witnesses, George's eyes were open wide as tears ran down his face and saliva ran down his chin. The executioner did attempt to recover George's face, but by that point, nobody could unsee what they had seen. And then with 2 subsequent switches thrown, each setting off their own currents, the execution was complete. At just 14 years, 7 months, and 29 days old, a doctor pronounced George Stinney Jr. dead. He was then, still is, and likely will always be cemented in history as the youngest person ever to be legally executed in the United States. Now, there are people that contest whether or not George's execution played out as dramatically as I just described it to you, claiming that the Bible booster seat and the slip of the death mask, they say that none of that ever happened, that these were dramatizations. So take that for what you will. Personally, I'm inclined to believe that those things really did happen, but of course, everyone is entitled to their own opinion on if they believe that these things truly happened or not. Personally, I just don't see why anyone would have felt the need to make those things up. Why would you need to fabricate a story like that? This was the execution of a 14-year-old child. You don't need to embellish that story to make it any more dramatic than it already inherently was. Following his execution, George was laid to rest in an unmarked grave at the Calvary Baptist Church Cemetery located in Lee County, South Carolina. Devastatingly, his family opted for an unmarked grave out of their fear that people might use George's burial site as a place to take out their racism and their misdirected hate. That said, though, although his grave was left unmarked, prior to his burial, George's parents opted for an open casket funeral, despite the considerable amount of damage that had been done to his body from the execution. Yes, they did this so that they could see him one last time, sure, but I also can't help but think that they wanted every single person that was in attendance that day to see exactly what had been allowed to happen to their child. Now, I don't know that they ever came directly out and stated that that had contributed to their decision, but in my opinion, it very much reminds me of the decision that Emmett Till's mother made just 11 short years later in yet another horrific case from our history that we should all be very ashamed of. Yeah, fuck you, Carolyn Bryant. I just know for a fact that she is burning up in hell's hottest little corner for what she did to that poor little boy. Ooh, God, I hate that woman. If you guys ever want me to cover Emmett Till's story, please let me know, because it would be my honor and privilege to do so. Not only do I want to honor and remember that sweet child as well, but I would also love any chance to verbally dog walk Carolyn fucking Bryant. Sorry, let me reel it in. Honestly, whether you want me to or not, I probably will cover Emmett Till's case sometime in the near future, because ever since I heard that case for the first time, it has always stuck with me. At any rate, though, for now, let me bring things back around and let me refocus myself back onto George's story, because despite how it may look, it's not exactly over yet. Now, not surprisingly, George's case has always been controversial, because duh. Even before his execution was carried out, Governor Olin D. Johnston received hundreds of letters and telegrams urging him to please reconsider George's execution. Johnston was George's only hope at clemency. However, despite the outcry from the public and the one-on-one meetings that Johnston held with George, ultimately he decided against stepping in and saving George's life. A decision he totally, for sure, probably did not make due to the fact that he was also up for re-election that very same year. Just like George's fuck-ass attorney. You know, heaven forbid these white men step up and help a black child. My God, the audacity of me to expect them to do so. And before anyone even thinks about trying to tell me that this does not have anything to do with race, one, are you fucking serious? And two, then explain this next thing to me. So just 2 years earlier, so 1942, 2 hours outside of Alcolu in Paris Island, a 16-year-old white kid raped and killed a little girl. The difference here, though, was that he was spared execution and instead only received a 20-year prison sentence for virtually the same crime that George stood accused of. Sure, they were in different counties and whatnot, but let's be real. I think we can all see the writing on the wall here. All George's attorney had to do was file a one-sentence appeal, and George's execution would have been automatically stayed until it could have been appealed to the Supreme Court. One singular sentence could have saved this boy's life, yet his attorney was too lazy and too worried about his political career to write it. Thankfully, though, although George was gone, he certainly was not forgotten. And with the advent of social media, although it may have taken decades, eventually George's remaining family members found themselves with a platform and they began sharing his story and rallying for his exoneration. They never stopped sharing George's story. They never stopped asserting his innocence. And most importantly, they never stopped trying to clear his name. And throughout the years, quite a few different groups of people got in contact with George's family, and they expressed their desire to help. And we're talking back as far as like 2004. To the best of my knowledge, it was Clarendon County historian George Frierson who ultimately really got this case picked back up and moving in the right direction. It did not take him long into researching George's case to know that he had to do something. So he started contacting some attorneys and reviewing the case with him, and before he knew it, he had people from Northeastern University of Law as well as the Civil Rights Restorative Justice Project. All of these people working pro bono on George's case in hopes of establishing a basis to have George granted a new trial. And in 2014, they did just that. They filed an appeal on George's behalf, and it was granted. The case was ultimately heard by 14th Circuit Court Judge Carmen T. Mullen in neighboring Sumter County in January of 2014. And while I think it's obvious to all of us here today that this was the right move, legally speaking, there is still a burden of proof, which in the case of an appeal falls on the appellant. The problem with that, though, was that this case was incredibly poorly documented, legally speaking. So couple that with the fact that they were working through this appeal 70 years later. I mean, to say that they were working an uphill battle, that would be a grievous understatement. Like I said, there was very little documentation that remained from the case for them to reference. Any court records had long since been disposed of. There was never really any physical evidence, so it wasn't like any of that could be re-examined. Most of the witnesses couldn't be called to speak, considering most of them were dirt by that point. But if there weren't any that were still alive, how reliable is someone's memory going to be regarding something that happened 70 years ago? Like I said, this was not an easy path forward for those who were fighting for George. But even so, they were adamant that the judge had no choice but to vacate George's conviction on the grounds that he simply had not received a fair trial, which facts. Conversely, though, the representative for the state argued that George had received as fair of a trial as anyone else would have in 1944. But need I remind us of that kid in Paris Island that only got 20 years for almost the exact same crime. The only difference was, I bet that he got a lawyer who actually tried. All in all, it took almost a year of fighting for George before finally on December 17th, 2014, Judge Mullen officially vacated George's conviction, citing, quote, a fundamental constitutional violation of due process in his prosecution. Following this ruling, the state announced that it would not be retrying George's case, given what little remained to actually work off of. They determined that any effort to retry the case it would have been pointless. And while George's family, as well as the supporters that they had gained along the way, all viewed this ruling as a cause for celebration, the remaining members of Betty June and Mary Emma's families, they were furious with this decision. They felt as though the girls' deaths had been completely overshadowed by public sympathy for the person that they still truly believed was responsible. And while objectively speaking, I think they're wrong, because ain't no way George could have killed those girls, I can understand how it would have been hard for them to have these wounds tore back open. And I can empathize with that, sure. But the goal is never just to get someone punished for a crime. Just like we talked about last week, that isn't justice. The goal is to hold the right person responsible. And devastatingly, that is just not what happened here. George was every bit as much a victim in this story as Betty June and Mary Emma were. His life, too, was wrongfully taken from him, every bit as much as those two girls' lives were robbed from them. But with that said, I'm sure the question you're left with, aside from the overarching question of what the fuck that this case leaves you with, but I have to assume that most, if not all of you, are wondering that, if not George, since it obviously wasn't him, who did kill these girls? Obviously, no one knows for sure, because it likely wouldn't have taken 70 years to clear George's name if there was another obvious suspect. But that isn't to say that there weren't any other suspects. Specifically, there is one man in particular that comes up a lot if you're researching this case, and that is a man named George Burke Jr., who will henceforth be referred to as GBJ because Lord have mercy if there aren't just too many Georges in the story to begin with. At any rate, though, basically as far back as the day that this shit happened, as in the day the girls' bodies were found, there have always been rumors swirling around that maybe GBJ could have been responsible. Why? Well, for starters, the ditch that the girls' bodies were found in, that was located on GBJ's father's property. A fact that, on its own, one could maybe argue was just an unfortunate coincidence. Because it wasn't located on their personal property, like it wasn't near their actual home. It just happened to be a secondary piece of vacant land that this family happened to own. I think it was actually located behind a church. But hold that thought, because I'm not done. Evidently, it also later came out that Betty and Mary were literally at GBJ's home prior to their death. Yeah, I guess they knew his mom, Amelia, pretty well, and they had stopped by there to ask her if she wanted to go and pick Maypops with them. Now, Amelia did decline because she was busy babysitting her grandson, GBJ's son, but as far as I know, this was actually one of the last times that anyone saw the girls alive. There were even rumors that went around that claimed that GBJ had pulled up in his lumber truck just as the girls were finishing up talking to his mom, and supposedly he went on to offer to give the girls a ride to go and find these wildflowers. Certainly not a good look. Why is an adult man inviting two young girls into his truck? And then for those two young girls to wind up dead? I've heard less compelling stories, but what do I know? But I just said that the girls knew GBJ's family, so why would him giving them a ride somewhere inherently incriminate him? You might be wondering. Well, simply put, GBJ allegedly just really wasn't a great guy. According to sources, numerous women from town had claimed that they had less than desirable or even downright scary experiences with him. I couldn't exactly find any details of what these encounters were, but I'm sure we could all at least try to imagine. And it is so wild to me that police never even so much as looked into the alibi or the whereabouts or the potential involvement of this known scary man whose property the girls' bodies were discovered on. Shit, in my non-professional opinion, someone with a big-ass truck definitely seems to have more of a capability of dumping these girls' bodies without leaving drag marks than a 90-pound 14-year-old child. But again, I'm no professional. Thankfully, though, and unfortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, GBJ did kick the bucket very shortly after George was executed. I think it was only like 2 or 3 years later. And supposedly, on his deathbed, this man confessed to having been the one to murder the girls. Too little too late, in my opinion, but I guess when you're about to take your dirt nap, you'll do whatever you can think of to try and reconcile with the big guy upstairs. And although GBJ's family has denied that he ever made such a confession, in my opinion, I truly think that him being responsible makes way more sense than it ever did to think that George could have been guilty. Not only were these girls found on his family's property, and not only did he have a vehicle capable of transporting the girls from the murder site to the dump site, but supposedly his father, George Burke Sr., henceforth referred to as GBS, apparently he did everything in his power to help to cover up this crime. Maybe even going so far as to purposefully steer police in George's direction. This man literally served as the jury foreman during George's trial. He participated in the searches for the girls following their disappearances. I mean, for all we know, he could have been the one to tell police that George had mentioned seeing Betty and Mary before they died. And as if that wasn't enough, believe it or not, it does even go further than that, because GBS, he might have had even more personal motivation to ruin the Stinney family's lives than allegedly just protecting his good-for-nothing son. Rumor has it that perhaps GBS might have made some, sexual advances towards George's mother at one point, and then because she supposedly rebuffed these alleged advances, there's definitely an argument to be made that maybe GBS did everything he could to protect his son while also trying to stick it to Amy Stinney. GBS was a prominent and well-respected businessman in Alcolu at the time that all this went down, so of course he had the power of suggestion with these people. He likely knew that if he planted a seed of doubt in this poor young black child, that the deep-rooted hate and racism that ran rampant in this town, it would do the rest for him. And it sort of kind of looks like that's exactly what happened, at least in my opinion. I don't know, man. Like I said, this story is all rumors and hearsay, and obviously none of it can really be corroborated or investigated at this point. So really, I guess it's up to us at this point to decide now. Based on what we know, what do we truly believe happened? Whatever the case may be, though, what we can say with almost 100% certainty is that whomever was responsible for this horrible crime, whether it was for many, many years or whether it was for just 3 years, GBJ, whoever truly took the lives of these little girls, they got to live out the rest of their days with 0 consequences. They saw no repercussions for having taken the lives of these 2 beautiful little girls. And then on top of that, through their cowardice and their own selfishness, they went on to directly contribute to the loss of the life of a 3rd completely innocent child. And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Rest in peace to poor George. He was so incredibly young, with so much life left to live, and to have it taken from him in such a terrifying and isolating and unfair way. Ugh, it makes me sick to my stomach. George was a shy, mild-mannered kid who loved his family and loved his pets. He loved to draw. He literally carried around a pad of paper with him so that any time that he saw something that sparked inspiration in him, he could stop and he could try and draw it, just right there and right then. Planes, in particular, were among some of George's favorite things to try to sketch. And beyond what George went through, I cannot even begin to imagine what his family went through. Experiencing everything they did, and then in the wake of his loss, just having to accept what happened and to live all those decades without any sort of resolution, it must have been absolute torture. I am, though, so unbelievably thankful that at the very least, Amy, Charles, and Catherine got to live long enough to see their brother's name be cleared. Something that obviously their parents never got to see. Oh, and they were finally able to erect an actual true memorial for George. Once his name was cleared and they no longer had to hide him out of fear and retribution, a beautiful memorial was built for him, and a headstone donning his picture was placed atop his grave. But again, the fact that both of his parents died before seeing this justice or seeing their son be celebrated, it is just so heartbreaking. I don't know. Obviously I'm so glad that his name has been cleared and that he's no longer labeled a murderer, not to mention an attempted rapist, but it all just feels too little too late, right? Sure, we can reverse the decision on paper, but there's nothing that we can do to give George his chance at life back. Nothing that can be done that can unmar the lives of the Stinney family or take away the pain that they were subjected to due to deep-rooted systemic failures in our justice system. Now, there was an attempt back in 2022 to pass a bill in South Carolina that would make the state responsible for paying $10 million to any person's family who was posthumously found to have been wrongfully convicted. You know, maybe encourage the state to make some better decisions. But even so, none of that changes what happened to George. Throughout the entire history of the American justice system, there will likely be few cases that will ever stand out as stark of a reminder of our system's darkest failures in the way that George's case does. George was just 14 years old when he became the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. And his story will forever serve as a haunting testament to the effects of racial injustice, rushed judgment, and the irreversible nature of capital punishment. So, yeah. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the case submission form that I have linked down in the description. And if by chance you're interested in anything about today's makeup, I will also make sure to have all of the information and the links for the products I used today listed down there for you as well. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every 10 days. Very soon here, that is going to be changing to every week. But for now, the date of my next video should be here on the screen for you. But if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always be notified when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. Until then, though, stay safe and have a good week. Bye! Ooh, it is hot already. I'm already sweating. But what I think eclipses that strategy... What was that word? Oh no. Go their separate way. That covers this case. I'm not doing well today. This is fucking nuts. if this specific geographical... Do I give up? Like, what is going on with my fucking ability to speak? I just can't personally say definitively if this specific geographical... If I could piece together a fucking actual video out of what I've been able to get, this is going to be incredible. George's father worked at the lumber... Oh my god. This is going to be a bitch to edit. There is a hair in my eyeball. I don't dislike it. I don't dislike it. I dislike how it looks. Are we so fucking for real right now? Couldn't be bothered to call in the medical examiner. Sure. I did not do that well at all. Whoo, bitch. I am fucking hot. What the fuck? Okay, this isn't working for me. How can I lose stuff that is like... I'm putting this shit down right in front of me. Like, how are we losing it? County historian George Frierson of...
I'm old.